what is the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report 2023?
It's the major flagship economic publication of the United Nations system, where we cover global economy, key economic trends in markets, particular segments of industries or issues, and we provide very specific perspective of the developing countries broadly to current economic problems globally. The 2023 report focused on international financial architecture and its key challenges and ways to reform it.
How is the Trade and Development Report different from other big trade-relevant reports like the ones produced by the WTO or the World Bank?
First of all, I think it differs from those other reports by its perspective, and it focuses mostly on developing a country and their basically need or the constraint that they faced in integrating well into the world economy. Another one, which is also important, is that it tends basically to come up with a more heterodox perspective that departs from, let's say, some of the mainstream recipes or policy recommendations that we sometimes hear from other corners.
Hello everyone, welcome to our Trade Reports series together with our special guest from UNCTAD. So one thing we do at the Geneva Trade Platform is to amplify and highlight important trade content that we feel people really need to dive into. And as part of this objective, we're basically speaking to different experts from different trade organizations in Geneva to highlight exactly what are the main arguments, what are the main issues in the reports that they have written. Today with us, we have Anastasia, who is the head of UNCTAD's Macroeconomic and Development Policies branch. Anastasia, good to have you.
Lovely, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. So Anastasia, can you start off by telling us what is the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report 2023?
Let me start explaining what UNCTAD Trade and Development Report is broadly. It's the major flagship economic publication of the United Nations system, where we cover global economy, key economic trends in markets, particular segments of industries or issues, and we provide very specific perspective of the developing countries broadly to current economic problems globally. So the 2023 report it comes out in autumn. The 2023 report focused on international financial architecture and its key challenges and ways to reform it.
Okay. And what would you say are three important messages from the 2023 report that you definitely want people to walk away from this interview knowing?
There are many, but I would say our subtitle says it all. The report is called Global Financial Architecture, Growth, Debt and Climate Realigning International Financial Architecture for New Challenges of Development. So the three issues of balanced, just and sustainable growth remains probably the tallest challenge for the global economy post-COVID. As we enter into post-COVID economic cycle, we realize that it's a very fragile path. Economies are going into divergent trajectories in advanced economies and developing countries too, which means that there is no currently identifiable engine to propel the world economic growth to a more robust setting. So whilst we have avoided, for example, a recession in 2023, we cannot say for sure that we will avoid it in 2024. It remains a concern. Mm-hmm. For a large group of developing countries, debt is a developmental issue. It's a developmental hurdle because they now spend more on their debt service than they can spend on their domestic healthcare and education and infrastructure needs. And it is, of course, a socio-economic issue. It's a political concern. It's an economic security risk. So we call the debt service burden a developmental crisis because it has very clear and current implications for countries' sustainability, economic stability, socio-political context. It's an issue. And there is an unabating problem of climate risks and costs that remains unresolved. Climate transition is underfunded and a lot of capital is not delivered to its intended targets and pledges. So whilst a lot of proclamations are being made and a lot of pledges are promised, a lot of funding is simply not being delivered. We're calling for there to be delivered to the causes that it's destined to. And we specifically call for the old economy for subsidies, for example, fossil fuels, and a fossil fuel economy to be eventually seized out and stopped, because a lot of commitments are still there, unfortunately.
Yeah. And during COVID, a lot of the trade that was happening was digital, and there was sort of like a boom. What would you say is a place of the digital trade or digital economy in this whole, spectrum that we are witnessing now, with the global economy sort of being very weak and stalling?
Generally, trade is now on a very weak foundation. Again, post-COVID, it's one of the slowest trade recoveries in merchandise in particular, historically. And it's a concern. It's a concern for global economic turnover. It's a concern for multilateral trust in the global system, because we are used to the idea that trade will deliver you prosperity, and then this prosperity will solve all other problems of development, inequality, climate, catch-up and adjustment. We cannot say that this is happening at the moment. There is a large problem of asymmetry between gains from trade, between the people who work for trade and the people who trade, if you want, the corporations, the corporate sector that trade. These asymmetries have become deeper through COVID. They have become much more magnified in the past 2 years. And this now undermines the very idea in free trade, in the principles and inevitable costs of countries who want to integrate into the world economy. Digital trade is part of the transformation of the global system. We need to know much more about the trends and availability of data, monitoring of data, and how this data can help developing countries approach integration in a fair way and in a way that would suit their local needs is key. So digital trade by itself will not solve developmental issues, but integrating it in a more balanced and systemic way will help.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Anastasia.
My pleasure.
We have a second guest also from UNCTAD today. We've got Nicolas, and he's an economist within the Macroeconomic and Development Policies branch. Nicolas, welcome. It's good to have you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so Nicolas, how is the Trade and Development Report different from other big trade-relevant reports like the ones produced by the WTO or the World Bank?
That's a very good question. Thanks for that. And actually, first of all, I think it differs from those other reports by its perspective, because it focuses mostly on developing a country and their basically need or the constraint that they faced in integrating well into the world economy. So yeah, that's a first thing. The perspective. Another one, I think, which is also important, that it tends basically to come up with a more sometimes heterodox perspective, or that departs from, let's say, some of the mainstream recipes or policy recommendations that we sometimes hear from other corners. And finally, I think one key point in all those reports over the years is basically the role that the state should play in basically guiding structural transformation. And in that regard, it looks at trade in a more, let's say, holistic approach and perspective, by also, linking trade with investment, technological diffusion, and all kinds of aspects which ultimately matters for development. So it's not only about, let's say, trade per se, but it's trade as a tool to basically promote development within a broader, let's say, context.
When you're preparing or working on the report, do you also consult, sources, let's say, from the World Bank or from the ITC, from other trade institutions?
Obviously, we use all kinds of data and resources that are partly produced by, various international organizations. So to make sure that we are up to date and we have access to all the important data that exist. Now, when it comes to the analysis and the policy conclusion that sometimes we gather from those data, that's where the prescription or the policy recommendation tend to differ. So, for instance, some organization will basically preach trade liberalization, and in our view, I mean, that's sometimes insufficient, to ensure structural transformation. We should have, a broader agenda than sometimes, just that perspective.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nicolas.
My pleasure.
Yeah, good to have you here. Thank you.